Hello, everyone, and welcome to my second ever Zero Effort game reviews where I will be reviewing Bioshock 2. I want to clarify that I didn't play through Minerva's Den, so I will not be reviewing that one. I will be reviewing that on a later date. And second of all, it is impossible to review a second game, without comparing it to its predecessor. So I will be comparing it a lot, but when I give its rating, I will be seeing it as a single, a separate entity title. I hope I've clarified that well. Okay, cool. With that in mind, let's jump straight into it. Visuals are way better than one. Of course, it's 3 to 4 years in the future, so the polygons and the models and everything looks way more better. With that in mind, the art direction is a bit hit or miss at times. Bioshock 1 felt like every single piece of art, like level from characters, models, and everything. Although some of them were visually ugly at times, the art direction was just amazing and how everything meshed together. Bioshock 2 a lot of times felt like they were just separate areas that weren't really connected, while Bioshock 1 felt like a completed weave together experience. And that's more of a testimony to how amazing Bioshock 1 is, and less of Bioshock 2 was bad. Because honestly, in comparison to a lot of modern day games, Bioshock's 2 art direction was amazing. It's just a pity because you kind of have to compare it to 1. And 1 is such a colossal masterpiece. And yeah, 2 basically is it does exactly what it's supposed to do. In 1, Rapture was under civil war against Atlas and Andrew Ryan. So you could see a lot of rubble and destruction. And in 2, it's 10 years later. Yeah, the world just became like the city of Rapture became a shithole slum, and you can kind of see it. Certain areas survived and have their luster, but remnants of poverty and stuff like that are rampant across the entire game. So it's a little bit more of a gritty, grimy game, while 1 was like very dark and horror because it's a glitzy place full of horror because Civil War, right? So if you compare the art direction to number 1, it falls a bit flat. But if you look at the art direction of Bioshock 2 as an individual standalone game, it is still an incredibly amazing game. And some of the level designs, like the cowboy area, cowboy like Midwest sort of like area with like the 3 levels, was amazing. The intercity areas were pretty cool too. The entire area where everything was overrun with coral and stuff like that, and like stuff like coral and like dripping water everywhere. Like visually, the game was beautiful. So yeah, 10 out of 10 for that. Stories and characters. Once again, a lot of people will straight up say that 1 story was absolutely amazing and 2 story was absolutely dog shit. I disagree with that statement heavily. 1 story and the character development of their villains and their side characters was a masterpiece. Bioshock 2, at best, was great. At worst, was okay. And that's the reality of it. It was not terrible. If you compare it to 1, of course. If you see it as a standalone, it was still pretty damn good. And I kind of want to go into detail about it. Like Andrew Ryan in number 1 and with Atlas, with lines like, we all make choices, but in the end, our choices make us. Or that entire sequence where, would you kindly? Like the twist. I watching a few of the developers talk about number 2. They said if we go for the twist, everyone's just going to compare us to number 1. We can't do that, so we're just going to try to make a solid story instead. I respect that decision, and honestly, they still did a solid effort. They tried to like build upon the ideas of what number 1 were doing, right? Because Rapture was a city about hypercapitalism and entrepreneurship and what that would lead to eventually, right? And then 2 is exploring about how the survivors of that hated what Ryan did and now have to survive in this shithole. So Lamb functionally made a new religion where the individual is sacrificed for the greater good of the collective. And that's why she sacrifices her own daughter, like in the Jesus metaphor, for like, to create a selfless, like godlike entity. And that's kind of like the primary theme around the second game. Sadly, because of it, she's really preachy and she constantly tells you in huge monologues about, how problematic this is and how you're a bad person, which honestly fits the theme of what she's trying to be. She's a religious kookhead that believes that community is important. She does exactly what she's supposed to do. I have no qualms with it. Did I like her as much as Andrew Ryan and Atlas? No. But she's still an absolutely, like, good villain. There were moments where she was like, I'm not going to use my ovaries for like this. I'm going to, like, I got my daughter through different means. And I was like, man, nah, you seem like the kind of person that would do that. She was a believable villain. She was a mother, a flawed mother that wanted to protect the entire world and hypocritical as hell, but she didn't see it. She was a great villain. Her daughter, Eleanor Lamb, which, is your daughter that you saved. And the fact that, she grew up in a fucked up world. So her worldview is fucked up. So, and she, of course, has the interaction between big daddies and little sisters kind of alludes to the idea that a lot of these girls have severe daddy issues. And, well, of course, you're living in a place called Rapture with civil war and people that are off their heads with drugs. So the fact that Eleanor like is hates her mother because for obvious reasons and is like looking through the eyes of all the little sisters about how the main character Delta, which actually I haven't talked about at all because I was talking about Lamb. So actually the main story actually follows around the story about how Delta, who is the big daddy, gets murdered and then he is trying to get back to Eleanor and save her. And Eleanor, as she watches you, Delta, go through and interact with all the side characters and the villains and how you treat them, whether you kill them or like show them mercy and all that, and how you save the little girls will dictate what sort of person she becomes eventually, whether she becomes good or evil or neutral and all that sort of stuff. Which, although not like the biggest twist, like it's not a twist at all. Although it's not like the greatest story, it was still very solid and very believable. This girl who never really had a missing father figure basically was watching what her father did and grew to become the sort of person that her father was like. That's a solid story. Once again, is it mind blowing? No. It's still a solid story. And then yeah, the lot more retrospective into looking at it like what happened after number one and like why people thought the way they did. Some of it was a little bit like, Easter egg. It's like, oh, look, but overall, they still did a really solid effort in it. And an aspect a lot of people don't talk about is that moment when you play as a little sister and you see their worldview of everything is just white and like angelic and feels like a heaven in comparison to the horror was a huge shock when you realize that these girls have been so traumatized that they basically view the entire world that they're living in with rose tinted goggles, literally. So when they say we're extracting stuff from angels, it's because they literally see them as angels and the blood is like rose pellets. And that was so fucked up and twisted and I loved it. So yeah, like if you compare number two story to one, and one's a masterpiece and two is not necessarily a masterpiece, but it was still damn good and I still really enjoyed it. And there's still moments where I was like, whoa. So yeah, the story was great. Music and sound design, honestly, if you watch number one, exact same critique. Most of the sound design was basically hand in hand, like great. I still think one was better in a lot of aspects because the moles and the cities and certain interactions, like in number one, there was a situation where you piss off a villain and then he starts playing like a classical song waltz. So the utilization of music was really done well in one. Two, it didn't do as much. Not exactly sure why, but actually I do know the reason why, which I'll go into gameplay breakdown. But yeah, so music and sound design was pretty solid. Now into gameplay breakdown. This one's a bit of a mixed bag. And I want to preface this is the biggest difference between 1 and 2. And I don't see a lot of people talking about it. So I kind of want to bring it up. 1 is a survival horror RPG. 2 is just a Borderlands 2 shoot 'em up type game with a bit of horror sprinkled in it. And that changes how I view those two games greatly. In 1, and I have to talk about 1, is the level layout and the enemy placement was greatly thought about on repeat. Every single interaction you do with an item or in the environment, and then when enemies started coming in and how they interacted was well thought and considered in most of the interactions. So every thing felt like new and fun and interesting and cool to interact with. In 2, they did it sometimes, most of it at the front section of the game, but by the end, everything was copy and paste. And if they wanted to amp up the difficulty, enemies became a bullet sponge and they just doubled up on stuff. You're scared of one big sister? How about you have 2? One big daddy is scary? How about you have 8? And I not necessarily was a fan of that. In 1, when I saw a big daddy, I knew what I was getting into. But like once I found a way to kill one of them, well, I felt like I had a huge sensation of accomplishment and it was awesome, right? In 2, the items, the weapons and the plasmoids, actually, to go into a little bit of detail about those two, they built upon the basis of 1. I still prefer some of the weapons in 1, but 2 definitely weren't boring. The most memorable ones were the little mini turret that you can throw down. And yeah, the shotgun upgrades where it barrel, some of the weapon modification upgrades and how they change the look of stuff, the spear gun of how it interacts with the physics and stuff. They did some cool stuff with the weapons. The issue is because 1, how the mobs were placed, 2, how the mobs respawned, and 3, how often they used the same trick over and over again. After a while, I didn't care how I used the weapons or how creative I used my plasmoids in the environment because I was never rewarded. Half the time, I would just switch between weapons of whatever ammo that I had in number 2, which I felt kind of bad because in 1, I had so much fun matching and experimenting and using all the different options that I had available, and I gained a lot of fun from that. In 2, it just didn't matter. But enough of the bad. If I look at from a standpoint of 1 to 2, in 2 they did a lot of quality of life upgrades. But some were done for good reasons and some I don't necessarily agree with. Number 1, the hacking change. Hands down, 100% one of the best changes they ever did from 1 to 2. I hated the hacking in 1. The hacking change in 2 was genius. The fact that hacking doesn't stop the gameplay as well on top of the mini games thing. So 1, it had this tube thing where you had to do puzzles. Scrap that. There's this little radar thing where you have to hit it precisely in the middle. The more difficult it is, the faster it is, and the more narrow it is. But the time doesn't stop, so you can still get being shot at and die while this is happening. That's great. I loved it. You shoot a camera and you go out into behind a pillar and you start hacking it. Love that stuff. The camera, I hate the camera still. But at least it's better now because now you can take it out, take a picture. The game automatically switches you back to the weapon that you were originally on. You kill it with using different sort of weapons and stuff to rack up more points, and you get an upgrade. I still didn't use it because I hated it, but at least it was an upgrade from number 1. And that's one thing that I really want to kind of openly state. Although I don't necessarily agree with all of the changes from 1 to 2 because 1 was a certain type of game and then they kind of changed the aspects of 2 in certain ways that I didn't necessarily agree with, they still most certainly listened to player feedback and tried to make appropriate changes. That camera and the mini game was 2 ones that I definitely agree with. They made up to tier threes of plasmoids, which were really, really cool, where you hold down the plasmoids and they do more. But honestly, it kind of felt weak in the sense that I already used all of them in one. So by the time I got to two, it just felt like the same with a little bit extra. I kind of wanted a little bit of a different switch or of a change. So yeah. In terms of weapons, once again, I'll say all of them were viscerally satisfying at the beginning, but as the game went on and because of mob placements wasn't taken into consideration, like when you get a little sister and you place her on the ground and starts to gather atoms, and then the mobs start coming after you. First few times is fun, but when you have to do it 6 times or 8 times per level, it bogs down and then it becomes boring and repetitive. And then you're just using whatever weapon type or ammo type that you have available at that point in time, which is gonna be like on repeat, right? So it was a bad thing. So the weapons were great, but because how the mobs interacted with the player, I grew to not give a shit about the weapons. And that's less a problem about the weapons and more a problem about how the mobs just spawned. But if I put it as a standalone and look at the game separate from one, Bioshock 2 is like a more fun, streamlined version of Borderlands 2, and honestly, I can't fault them for that. It Borderlands is like a fun gaming sequence, and honestly, it's kind of what their genre took went up to with with the company 2K. So yeah, completely understand why. Even the concept in number one, because it's a lot more horror. So using your weapon in switching your hand into your ice and then shooting it took like that 1 second difference, which is I feel like it's another thing that they took from Resident Evil 4 that create that extra sensation of suspense while you're switching weapons while all the panic is happening. In 2, they took it out. So now you have two hands, one with the weapon and one with the plasmoid that you can kind of do concurrently. Still cool and fun, but it was used for a different reason to make combat more efficient because mobs are spawned more and they come faster. So you have to fight faster. So once again, I don't, because things are coming so fast, I don't have time to think about what I want to do in terms of the combat. I just shoot and react. One, things were spaced out well enough that I was given a chance to react to the environment and then use my weapons in different combinations and experiment. Two, a lot of the times I felt like I just shoot with whatever that I had available. And once again, if I take it away from one, it was still a fun experience with a lot of different variations of weapon types and plasmoids. The same sort of concept on one. Just sadly, because of how the mobs and the levels and like the interactions were designed, I didn't get to fully utilize the weapons and the plasmoids. Next time, I probably would try to do it better with all of this in mind, but it's a bit of a pity that I couldn't enjoy it as much as I did from a first time play experience in one. So yeah, it's pretty much I feel like all that I have to say. Oh wait, a few extra things. The interaction of big sisters becoming a new introduction was a stroke of genius. The fact that the little sisters growing up to become big sisters and them hunting you down using psionic abilities, super cool. Really loved it. But once again, kind of got bogged down when they just doubled up him and just kind of started throwing them in whatever. Didn't like that. The fact that you can summon Eleanor as a big sister to do shit. Mwah. Watching her just telekinesis a person across the field and then impale her. That was pretty awesome. But yeah, I kind of feel bad about this review because I played Bioshock 2 immediately after I played Bioshock 1. So it's impossible to not kind of compare both of the experiences. And when things were kind of not thought about or left out, sadly because the developers were different and their view of what they wanted to focus on was different. Yeah, I will say Bioshock 2 is still a great game. Bioshock 2 is not a masterpiece by any means. Because a lot of the moments and aspects of the art, story, music, and gameplay, they're How I would explain it is that Bioshock 1, all of the pieces were combined together perfectly in unison to create a concoction of a video game. Bioshock 2 felt a lot of individual great ideas that were kind of roped together, is the best way that I would kind of explain it. So there was a lot of enjoyment that I still had out of Bioshock 2, but it just lacked those interpersonal connections between these great ideas that brought them together that would have elevated Bioshock 2 to a higher level. I still think that it is an absolutely great game. And I would still go back and play it and use different like tonics and plasmoids and weapons and all that. But yeah, if I honestly compared Bioshock 2 to 1, I'd give it a good. But because I'm not, it's a great. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed my second ever review, and that was Bioshock 2. Hope it wasn't too elongated, but honestly, this is like the also the 18th. No, this for this one, it's probably the 30-second take. So I don't want to do it anymore. So this is what we're getting. Future Daniel, if you watch this, just figure out what I did wrong. Okay, then. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the third review. Probably Minerva's Den and then Bioshock Infinite. Bye.